Well, I don't know if you've noticed this. I know I have. There are times where a otherwise good weekend could be ruined by a simple text message or a phone call or a comment that someone will make. Right? I might be doing well mentally. I might be happy. I might be, feeling good. And then I get a notice. Maybe it's a notice from a friend or a family member, or maybe you've gotten a message from somebody at work and you've got some disappointing news. And all of a sudden, what has been a good mood and a good vibe all of a sudden changes. Right? You've probably experienced something like that if you've been alive long enough. Occasionally, while it's harder to notice these times, because sometimes it's easier to notice the bad than the good, but occasionally the opposite can happen as well. Maybe you are not doing so great. Maybe it's been a rough week. Maybe your mental health is not great. Maybe you're struggling. Maybe you're just kind of feeling heavy. And maybe you get a message from a friend. Just maybe it's a simple message. Hey, I just want you to know I've been thinking about you and I've been praying for you. And that simple message can lift your spirit just a little bit. It doesn't change your circumstances, but it lifts your spirit. Maybe you run into somebody and just that what seemingly chance encounter can all of a sudden give you a little bit more joy, a little bit more peace, a little bit more encouragement. Well, the reason that I bring up this concept of how one encounter can lift spirits is because that's exactly what happens in Exodus chapter 18, which we're going to study today. In Exodus chapter 18, we find Moses, who has had a lot of wins. If you've been with us for some time, we've been going through the book of Exodus, and we've seen a very dramatic journey where there's a lot of evidence of God doing some amazing things. And Moses, as the leader, has the front row seat to all of the good that God has been doing. However, there is also a lot of pain that Moses has to deal with. I mean, think about Moses' life just real quickly. All right, Moses was born into slavery as an Israelite under the Egyptian slaves. His life is in danger from the moment he is born. He's adopted into a family of his people's enslavers. I mean, think about that, right? That you got the slaves and you got the masters. And what if this child, Moses, he was previously a part of the enslaved peoples, and yet he's adopted and now is raised in the master's home. And imagine being raised with that and what that does to your own identity. Seeing your own people spoken of with such contempt. He struggled with his identity to the point where he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite and he murders the Egyptian. And then he has to flee into exile. And now he's away from both his peoples and his cultures, right? For Moses, if you were to ask Moses, who are you? On any given day, he might say, I'm an Egyptian because he was raised in Pharaoh's court. Or on any other given day, he might say, no, I'm an Israelite. He was both, but he's in exile from both peoples, grieving over the plight of his people, even as he is tending flocks in the wilderness. His people are always on his mind and his heart. Then he's called by God to return home and to fight against the most powerful man alive, Pharaoh. And when he obeys, at first things only get worse. And as such, his people hate him and accuse him of bringing more harm. But then he leads his people out of Egypt only to have them turn on him in anger and fear. Right? They finally leave Egypt, and we covered this the past weeks, and they get to the Red Sea, and the people cry out and accuse Moses, you've brought us here to die. And then, after God parts the Red Sea, get through there, then they don't have any water. Again, people accuse Moses, you brought us here to die. God supplies water, but then they don't have any food. Moses, you brought us here to die. God provides the food. And then last week we saw, after all of that, as if it's not bad enough, then the Amalekites attack. Can you imagine how exhausted Moses must have been? I mean, y'all, leadership has unique blessings, but unique challenges as well. I feel this way sometimes as a pastor. Being a pastor, you have a front row seat to some of the best moments of people's lives. Wedding days. Right? I get to see the bride and groom up here in all their glory, right? It's awesome. It is so great. I get the front row seat to the joy. But you also get a front row seat to some of the worst moments in people's lives. Moses had unique blessings, but he had unique challenges as well, and he must have been exhausted. In that context, his father-in-law, Jethro, comes. And when Jethro comes, what we see is that the joy and the worship and the rejoicing and the celebration of being with Jethro, that would have had to have been an immense encouragement. If you're someone who likes sermon points, point number one, family brings healing. Exodus 18, chapter 18, verse 1. Moses' father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, heard about everything that God had done for Moses and for God's people Israel when the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. Y'all, Jethro, it's significant that we don't know a lot of information about most people's family members throughout the Bible. I mean, if you think about the amount of people that are actually mentioned in the Bible compared to all of the hundreds of thousands of millions of people who were present here but not named, we really know very little about most biblical characters. And yet it's significant that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, plays such a significant role in Moses' life and in this narrative. You know, father-in-laws generally don't have the best rep. Some of y'all have experienced the curses of some bad father-in-laws. Maybe a few of y'all have experienced blessings. Regardless, Jethro, father-in-law, plays a huge role despite the fact that he lived in an entirely different region at a time when transportation is limited, right? And communication is limited. He's not emailing or texting Jethro. Not only that, but Jethro is a pagan priest. He's actually a pagan priest of Midian. Likely, he was the high priest of Midian, given the word used in Hebrew to describe Jethro. He's a pagan priest, and yet he ministers to Moses. All right, two things to point out here. One, be careful. I think we need to be careful sometimes about our insider-outsider language. You know, sometimes we have preconceived notions about who or the type of people that God's going to use, and then we have everyone else on the outside. Oftentimes, the Lord has bigger plans than we think. Oftentimes, he uses people that you and I might be tempted to discard or write off. The pagan priest, Jethro, father-in-law, living in a different region, yet has an enormous impact on Moses. Secondly, though, through Moses' relationship with Jethro, as we're going to see in this passage, he actually experienced a conversion. Now, we don't know what type, and sometimes scholars will debate. Was this a full conversion and he dropped all of the worship of pagan deities? Maybe. But if nothing else, he credits Yahweh, the God of Israel, very clearly as the God of all gods in this. So, as Jethro comes to Moses. Now, remember, Moses is in pain, y'all. Moses is in pain. Lots of blessings, right? But a heavy call has taken its toll. There's two clues in this verse of the pain Moses has been experiencing. So Zipporah, that's Moses' wife. Zipporah and the children had been taken away by this time, right? Now, Moses likely sent them away at some point for safety reasons, right? Journeying in the wilderness with all the enemies and the possibility of starvation, lack of water, it was dangerous. Moses is a prime target if there's ever rebellion, and so Moses likely sent his family away for safety reasons, which means that at a time of great pain, Moses did not have his family there to comfort him. We don't know much about the relationship that Moses and Zipporah had, but I think we can presume that Zipporah's presence there and his children's presence there would have been a comfort to Moses. I think you probably have experienced this in your life. At a time of great pain, feeling lonely makes it so much worse. So through at least some of, if not all of the trials that Moses has been experiencing that I just enumerated, he was alone. Family and I, we every once in a while we'll kind of watch some documentaries or every once in a while reality TV. That's not really our speed, reality TV, but But we went into this show called Alone. I don't know if you've ever seen this show, but it's like this wilderness show where they'll take people out to these remote areas and drop them off by themselves, and all they've got is their own skills and a few supplies they brought with them to survive. And the person who lives the longest out there, not they don't die, but the person who like stays long enough and doesn't kind of tap out, they win. They win some kind of money. I don't know how much it is. But it's interesting as you watch the survival show Alone, every week different people will tap out. It's like, it's too much for me. I can't do it any longer. And it's a lot of different reasons. A lot of times it's food, right? They're hungry, right? And so some of them are kind of master fishermen so they can, catch some fish, or really good with bow and arrow and so they can go hunt. But a lot of them end up like just kind of living on berries, and that you can't do that for so long, right? And so they get hungry. For others, they get sick. But what's interesting is for all of them, especially when they're struggling, they want their family and friends. At their lowest points, the things that they're thinking about in this show is, I need to be with my people. I don't know who your people are, right? Like, we've all got different situations, different family situations, different friend situations. But I'm guessing that you have at least one or two, if not a group of people that are your people. And when you're struggling, you need your people. Moses was alone. His people, his family, was not there. Not only that, there's another clue. All right, Moses' son, his name is Gershom, right? Which he names him Gershom because in Hebrew it gives this message: I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So the name of Moses' oldest child is a representation that for Moses, life is hard. Right? He named his son, in essence, life is hard. That's pretty rough, right? I mean, imagine naming your son, life is hard. Come here, life is hard. Life is hard, clean your room. Life is hard, wake up. That's sort of what Moses did with Gershom. Life is hard. I was a sojourner in a foreign land. Y'all, Moses is in pain. But there's hope. There's hope. He had one son named Gershom. It's kind of rough because the other son had a great name, Eleazar, because he had said, the God of my father was my helper and rescued me from Pharaoh's sword. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, along with Moses' wife and sons, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, are coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons. So, y'all, at a time when Moses was really struggling, he gets this message: your people are coming back. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, is bringing his wife back. He's bringing his kids back, and there's going to be this great reunion. And not only that, even the mention of Moses' other son is a reminder that yes, life is hard, but God is good. Eleazar, the God of my father was my helper, and he rescued me. Family, there is always hardship in life, but the Lord is always with us to provide for us. And one of the ways he provides for us is by giving us family. Now, let me be clear, because for some of y'all, family has some really big baggage. So I want to be clear to define family. Because oftentimes what the Bible does is it expands and changes our understanding of what something is. For example, Jesus in his earthly ministry, he was ministering in a crowd, and some people came and kind of knocked on the doors like, Jesus, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your father and your mother and your brothers are out there and they need to talk to you. And Jesus' response is interesting. He says, these are my mother and brothers. See, the Bible redefines even what family is. So if you are someone who struggles because maybe your biological family has harmed you in many ways, hear the redefinition that Jesus brings us by saying you have now an extended spiritual family as well. Question for you and for me is, are we open to receive these family blessings? Hebrews 12:24 says this: He says, let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good deeds, and let us not neglecting meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. Family, what we see in this story throughout all of the highs and lows of Moses' journey is that one of the ways that God provided for Moses is support and encouragement through family. We see this actually at another crisis point. I don't know if you remember this, but when God originally called Moses at the burning bush, that was like a verbal wrestling match between God and Moses, and of course God won, but he didn't want to do it. He was terrified, right? This was a crisis point, and yet one of the first things God does is he calls Aaron, Moses' brother, and he meets them in the wilderness. One of the ways that God provides for us in our need is through our family. The hard part is, and we've talked about this before, when you're struggling, a lot of times your tendency in mind is to pull away, right? And sometimes for good reasons, because let's be real, you know that we are real at this church. Let's be real, sometimes family hurts you. Sometimes your biological family hurts you. Sometimes your spiritual family hurts you. Bring disappointment, even sense of betrayal. And what we have learned to do to protect ourselves is we pull away rather than risking new pain by engaging. But the problem is when you pull away, yes, you save yourself from pain, but you also save yourself from the possibility of healing. I think I've quoted Jackie Hill Perry before, who said the church has given me some of the biggest hurt and some of the biggest healing. Healing. Family brings healing. The question is, are you open to receive it? Now, in one sense, by virtue of the fact that you're here, you're not cutting it off, right? You wouldn't be here if you were cutting it off. So my question is, what does it look like perhaps for you to engage even a little bit more significantly with family? And anytime there's a challenge at church or anywhere in any kind of like speech, motivational talk, whatever, it can feel a little burdensome sometimes. Like I'm saying, hey, I've got a task for you, and I know you're already busy, you're already tired, you're already overwhelmed in life. Well, here's something else. That's not what this invitation really is. If you are overwhelmed and burdened and feeling heavy, my invitation is, would you share that load with others in this space? If you're struggling mentally right now with depression or anxiety, do you realize that there's other people in this church who know what that's like? If you're struggling with depression, you're not the only depressed person in the room. And I've experienced firsthand the immense blessing of connecting with someone else who is struggling but hasn't given up and has experienced Jesus' mercy in the midst of struggle. Family, lean in to the church. Lean into the community. Lean into relationships. Risk the hurt. And for some of y'all, if you're at a place where life is especially heavy and maybe some circumstances in your life make it impossible or difficult at least to lean in, at least remember the truth that family brings healing by God's grace. And consider when you can lean in. Family brings healing. Here's a question for you. Do you have a Jethro in your life? And maybe this is cheesy, but maybe it's memorable, right? Because Jethro in the story, as we're going to see in just a moment, he brings immense blessing to Moses. At a time where Moses is discouraged inevitably, Jethro comes, and we're going to see a joyous reunion. And it really changes Moses' outlook and his trajectory. So do you have a Jethro in your life, or would you be a Jethro? You actually need both. As Christians, the Lord has called us to rely on one another. And sometimes that means a friend, a peer. Sometimes that means a mentor. And maybe you're sitting here thinking, yeah, but I don't have any mentors. We could help you with that. There are some wonderfully mature, wise men and women in this church who are available. And if you find yourself struggling, or even not even struggling, but just like, it would be so nice to have someone that I could talk to, gain a little perspective, pray with, someone to listen to. Maybe you're like, hey, I would go see a counselor, but it costs too much. We have some men and women in this church that I would be happy to connect you with. I could connect you with them today. We need mentors. Even as I was preparing for the sermon, I realized something. I have a bunch of kind of Jethros in my life, and some folks that I meet with monthly who are mentor figures for me. But I realized something. I realized that when I'd first come out to West Charlotte to kind of start doing church planning, and then we merged and everything, I had a church plant coach who was a Jethro to me, a mentor to me, and so I could bring him all the challenges of just, the church life and doing life in West Charlotte. And I realized, you know what? I haven't spoken to him in like 2-3 years. No wonder I'm feeling a little confused and wondering, like, what should I do here or there? It's like I've lost my Jethro. We all need mentors. That's one of the things we see in here. But there's another message. This is a 2-pointer sermon, so just to let you know. Here's the second point. Celebration is essential. So Jethro comes, right, verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and then kissed him. They asked each other how they had been, and they went into the tent. Moses recounted to his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that confronted him on the way, and how the Lord rescued them. Moses is not afraid to complain at times. At different points, he complains. At different points, he loses his temper, right? He loses his temper once and kills a guy. And then later in the wilderness, he loses his temper and he just strikes a rock. That's a step up, right? At least he didn't kill anybody. But Moses, he's one of these people that, like, if he's mad, you'll know, right? If he's feeling bitter, he's going to complain, and he does to the Lord several times. But what you see here and what you sense as you imagine yourself experiencing this family reunion is that this is a time of joy for him. I felt convicted in my life because I'm not really, and by the way, when I say celebration, it's another word for thanksgiving. It's another word for gratitude. It's another word for praise. It's choosing to see God's hand at work in your life, even when you could choose also to focus on all the stuff that's going wrong. Sometimes we need to make choices in how we interpret what we see in life. Read a quote one time that says, "We see the things in our life not as they actually are. We see the things in our life as we are." Which means when you look on the circumstance of your life, the degree to which you are encouraged or discouraged by what you see actually may tell you more about how you're doing internally than it does about your circumstances. And haven't we all experienced this? Haven't we experienced people who are going through hell, and yet by God's grace, they have a measure of peace? And I look at wonder, like, man, I want that. But the opposite is true too, right? Like, we've all encountered people who, like, life is going to be lifing always, right? But like, it's not that bad. And yet, everything they see is just bad and negative, and doom and gloom. Sometimes we need to make choices to see what God has done for us and focus more on that. Now, and by the way, that doesn't mean that you're ignoring the bad. It actually says in verse 8, he talks about the hardships that confronted them on the way. It's not like Moses was kind of doing this thing of like, oh, I'm just going to pretend all is good. No, he was real with Jethro as he was recounting all the stuff. He talked about all the trials and the pains and the hardships and the tiredness, but he also chose to focus on how God had rescued them and all the good things that God had done. Celebration is good for us. Proverbs 17:22 says, "A joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones." You know, thanksgiving or giving thanks to God for the things, that is a command in Scripture. It's not optional. It is a command. We are commanded to give thanks, to celebrate God's work in our lives. In fact, another place in Scripture says, give thanks in all circumstances. But what about when life is hard? In all circumstances. But what about when disappointment sets in? In all circumstances. And family, sometimes this is a discipline. I'm not someone particularly who enjoys doing things when it doesn't feel natural, right? I'm probably, and this is where God needs to continue to sanctify me, but I live oftentimes, pretty candidly and openly out of my emotions and how I'm feeling in the moment. But there are times when God commands me, David, I know you feel discouraged right now, and I'm still commanding you to give me thanks. And you might feel like, well, that's kind of harsh. No, it's not. It's not. Because as we choose to celebrate God's hand in our lives, we're actually lifted up a little bit in our spirits. This is medicine for the soul. Celebration is essential because it's good for us, but it's also good for God. It glorifies him. In verse 9, Jethro rejoiced over all the good things the Lord had done for Israel when he rescued them from the power of the Egyptians. He says, "Blessed be the Lord," Jethro exclaimed, "who rescued you from the power of Egypt and the power of Pharaoh. He has rescued the people from under the power of Egypt." Celebration gives glory to God. It's good for God. If you were to do something very kind for somebody and to provide for them, kind of write a check to, help them out with the light, help them out with life, maybe kind of bring them some groceries and, maybe watch their kids if you got kids and, help them out and maybe transport them to their work. If you were to devote yourselves to somebody, to care for them, provide for them day after day after day after day after day, if they were to ignore the blessings and instead only focus on what's not going well, that's actually not going to be encouraging to you, is it? Now, to be clear, we don't do good things for others so that they will thank us. That's not the point, right? But it is natural that as we pour out love to others, that love is received and reciprocated, at least, if nothing else, in terms of thankfulness. And here's the reality. Because we're humans and God's God, there's not a whole lot that you can do for him, in the sense that he needs something from you that he can't get anywhere else, right? I mean, what can you give God? He's got everything, right? But as a loving Father who's near to us, it delights him when we're thankful, when we're grateful, when we celebrate the good. And sometimes, I would suggest, it probably glorifies him most when you thank him in the midst of hardship. Because it's easy to be thankful when all is well. But it's more an act of worship when you're choosing to see the good in the midst of the hard. Celebration is essential for the Christian, not optional, because it glorifies God. Throughout this conversation between Jethro and Moses, God was spoken of often, right? And what we see, what we read in these verses, this is just like a little excerpt. It was a much longer conversation, right? We'd be here all day if they actually transcribed the entire conversation between Moses and Jethro. We'd be here all day. It was a long conversation. And throughout this long conversation, y'all, God's name was mentioned constantly. Like when gossip happens, right? Someone who's not present in the conversation is being spoken of, and gossip has a negative connotation, spoken of poorly. But imagine Jethro and Moses gossiping God's name for his glory. They were constantly talking about him, the glory that went up, the worship that went up to God through this conversation. Two friends, two family members who were just speaking about how good God is. God was praised. It's good for Moses. It's good for us. It's good for God, but it's also good for others. good for others. Throughout this conversation, some type of conversion happens with Jethro. We don't know exactly what that means, and the text doesn't tell us whether he abandoned all of the gods of Midian that he was previously worshiping and the priest for, but we know for certain that Jethro sees the power and the might of God in a new way. Now I know, verse 11, that the Lord is greater than all gods because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. Family, the goodness of God being told and celebrated had a changing effect on Jethro's heart. Recounting the good deeds of the Lord changed Jethro's heart. And we talk a lot about doing outreach and wanting to care for our neighbors, love our neighbors, and make disciples. You know, of course, evangelism is a part of that, like sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. But the more convinced we are about this good news, the more convinced we are, the more we're willing to remember the good things that God's given us. The more powerful we are as witnesses to a watching world. I don't know about you, but if I see somebody who is speaking about a certain circumstance, but they're really discouraged about it, it doesn't make me excited to do what they're doing. For example, I remember this when Celia and I were just dating and kind of entering into that engaged period. Every once in a while, I'd come across someone who was just miserable in marriage. And they were just miserable, and they were just complaining. And I was like, well, stop. I don't want to be around you. Like, I want to hear somebody who's excited about marriage because that's what I'm getting ready to get into, right? Not to say that the watching world needs to see us as like chipper all the time and falsely happy, right? That's not the message. But the more we can devote ourselves to choosing to see God's goodness in the midst of the hard, the more that the watching world is going to want what we have. Celebration is essential. It's good for others. It's good for God. It's good for us. And just kind of to close this out, y'all, family celebration remembers Jesus Christ. And in essence, that's what we're doing, right? We're witnessing in this passage, we're witnessing a family reunion. But basically every Sunday, that's what we have here. We have a family reunion where we get together, weekly. And if you've been gone for a little while, right, you get to come back and you get to have a reunion, see your friends, see your family. And we get to celebrate together remembering Christ. Moses rejoiced in freedom from Egypt. We rejoice in freedom for sin. Ephesians 1:3 says, all praise to God, the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms because we are united with Christ. Family celebration remembers Christ. This is one of the reasons, again, why it's so important to come together. Hebrews 12, as we read earlier, exhorts us to not neglect meeting together, not neglect coming together, because we need one another. Sometimes, y'all, I can get a little bit complainy and whiny, right? My counselor calls that Eeyore, right? Eeyore from the old Winnie the Pooh, and he was always like, moping around, and every day it was just really painful. And there's some times that I'm like, I'll be talking about life. He's like, David, this sounds a little bit like Eeyore. All right, fine. But we need one another. We need one another to remind one another of the goodness of God in the midst of a fallen world. Family celebration lifts our spirits and reminds us who Christ is. And here's the final thing. Family, Jesus is your Jethro. Jesus is your Jethro. Jethro comes in at a time of great discouragement, and he breathes new life into Moses. And in the following text, which we didn't have time to get into today, Jethro actually counsels Moses. Not only is Moses tired from all life, but he also has never learned any leadership principles, and he's trying to do everything for 100,000 people all by himself. And Jethro's like, stop. This is not good. You're killing yourself. And he teaches him how to delegate. Again, we don't have time to get into that. But you see, Jethro is an immense blessing for Moses. He saves Moses from discouragement, lifts his spirits. He saves Moses from wearing himself out, gives him counsel. You see, Jesus is your Jethro. He's already done the battle against sin. He's already won that war for you. So you're forgiven. And the sins in your life and the shame in your life can never separate you from the love of God because of what Jesus has done. He's already fought the battle, and yet it's not like he's done. It's not like he says, all right, I died for you, now good luck. No, he's like, I died for you, and now I'm with you every single day of your life. When you need encouragement, I'm here. When you need a reminder to go call your friends, I'm here. When you need a reminder to get to church so you can experience the joy of a family reunion, I'm here. When you need some counsel, I'm here. It's kind of my name. I'm the wonderful counselor. Jesus is your Jethro. He has done it all, and he will continue to walk with you, drawing you closer to him, drawing you closer to others. Family, it's a joy to be able to celebrate together. Let's lean into that, and let's recommit ourselves, not just to Christ, but to his church. Let's pray.